These are the times that try men's souls, or when everything seems to go wrong and something seems to go right, we might overvalue it. Or don't count your chickens before they've hatched, or call no man happy till they're dead. All these things may be things to look at when we talk about the current moment. A year ago, Alex O'Keefe and Anton Yeager and Antonio Borriello were sticking a fork in left populism, and today it seems to have already reemerged in a new phase. Now, I have hastened caution on any judgment about Mandani as a bourgeois or democratic socialist politician, because frankly, we don't know what he's going to really be like yet. We are in May. He hasn't even been in office a year. He's already dealt with balancing the budget, which a lot of progressives have thought were magic, even though it's largely about re-amortization schemes and not even taxing the wealthy, and aid from the state government, which makes Mandani dependent on Hook Hill. He doesn't have a lot of options for the future as far as like getting revenue up, and so it's going to be interesting to see how he delivers on things. There has been pushback on several symbolic things that I'm not going to go into, but the bigger pushback has been his embrace of YIMBYism, which pro-YIMBYists will find too meager, and anti-YIMBYists who think that YIMBYism won't actually do what it says find probably be a backdoor to more development without the lowering of rents. It's hard to say, and it's really early to say, but looking at that program myself, I'm not particularly optimistic that it's enough to significantly lower rents, or that it's got enough oversight to actually be for affordable housing. But again, it hasn't been implemented yet. Now, this brings me to a tale of 3 articles, all from the orbit around the DSA. One is from Light and Air, the Marxist Unity Group's organ, called Sailing into the Storm by Sid W.C. Sid has not been on the show, but he is one of the people in the MPC and a major MUG member. We are looking at Zohran Mamdani, There is No Socialism Without Black Socialism by Tara E. for Geese Magazine. And then The Populists and the Workers' Party by Bidea Armozi and Amanda Levy. And Prometheus Mag. I either have I don't have guides up for all these magazines yet, but I will for those who want to get a feel of their core arguments and editorial line. That will be available for free on my Patreon. But anyway, into this, we're going to start with the Sailing into the Storm article from Light and Air by Sid CW. I think I said WC. That's my aphasia again. Which was published by Marxist Unity Group, which is a caucus within the DSA that critiques the political relationship between the NYC DSA and the New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, which has also come up to question from people like Hassan Piker asking why Zohran hasn't endorsed the DSA slate in New York consistently. And that itself caused a small storm in DSA X Twitter for obvious reasons. But Sailing into the Storm's core argument is this. Sid argues that while Mandani's progressive affordability agenda has achieved some legislative victories thanks to an allegiance with Hochul in the State House, the NYC DSA's leadership is making a dangerous mistake by blanking him blindly in trying to forego public criticism altogether. By allowing socialist politics to be absorbed into closed-door government negotiations, the organization risks compromising its core identity as an independent class struggle-oriented party And this article reasserts that the DSA must maintain political independence from both bourgeois policies and the capitalist state, which I think you can't do as long as you're in the Democratic Party, but that's just me, even when one of its own members holds executive power. So there's a dilemma in the socialist holding of executive power according to Marxist Unity principles. This has a lot to do with the ideas of Lars Lee and Mike McNair and the role that the legislature should have in government. In his early tenure as mayor, Mamdani has pursued popular fixes such as bike lanes, pop loads, and notched a few progressive wins such as partial universal childcare funding, increased petit taxes on wealth, and a rent freeze for rent-stabilized tenants. But to avoid political ineffectiveness of being forced into implementing austerity, Mandani has had to make several controversial non-socialist, maybe even non-progressive concessions. These include bringing back the winter homelessness sweeps, endorsing the moderate cough cough Governor Kathy Hochul, praising the NYPD after a shooting, and pushing DSA back candidates out of the congressional race to support, well, frankly, a liberal Zionist. There is an issue here on compromise, and to understand compromise, one needs to know what is a legitimate or illegitimate compromise, or what one might call a rotten or non-rotten compromise. Drawing on Wilhelm Liebknecht, the author notes that making compromises to pass legislation is a necessity for an opposition party, that is being abstentionist. However, the compromise becomes illegitimate when it hides or forgets the class struggle basis of the party, because the basis of this compromise is to forward class struggle. So this is the grounds of legitimacy, according to Sid. Right now, because Mandani and the DSA operate with a high level of secrecy, the NYDSA, regular members and working class cannot see what the political prices are being paid for behind closed doors. And this is all to the advantage of establishment Democrats, which is a problem. The author points out that Mandani's surprise endorsement of Brad Lander over the DSA endorsed Alexa Avilas for Congress was proof that Mandani would circumvene the organization's democratic endorsement process when it conflicts with its own political calculations. And the DSA has no way to control that. And the NYC DSA, whose leadership is largely seemingly under operating orders from Groundwork, which is another caucus, a more reformist, although they are a partyist caucus. I don't want to be too unfair to them. That reveals a reality that the NYDSA leadership has ignored, that the mayor's office and the DSA as an independent organization have and necessarily have fundamentally different goals, and that the NYC DSA has become increasingly recalcitrant and even somewhat abnegationist towards its own base, kind of like the Democratic Party is towards them, but nonetheless. The NYC DSA currently lacks a formal structure to hold an executive member like the mayor accountable, and neither does the national. They really don't have the resources to do it, neither structurally nor resourcefully. They don't have enough of the electorate to command it by feet, and they don't have enough money to really run against him. This renders the socialist leverage model useless in trying to maintain a relationship with the mayor's office that holds to any kind of programmatic goals. And this is always going to be a problem with the executive, because the executive is not the place for that. When challenged on Mandani's controversial actions like the homeless sweeps, the NYC DSA co-chairs have weak-heartedly defended him to the public embarrassment. The author warns that tying the fortunes of the entire socialist movement to the approval rating and survival of a single celebrity politician is a highly volatile strategy, but one that brings short-term gains at often long-term losses, something that we saw explicitly in the DSA rise and fall between 2015 and 2021. Now, it didn't completely fall, but the DSA lost at least a quarter of its membership in 2021. after the Bernie concession to the Dems. So what does Sid say to do? Well, he says that we should stop giving Mandani a blank check and reassert the DSA as an independent decision maker. My resort to that is the DSA is not structured to be an independent decision maker, which is its own problem. While Mandani must navigate the capitalist state to deliver the goods and prevent austerity, the broader working class still needs a distinct, transparent socialist organization on the streets and workplaces and open via class struggle, not just in the catacombs of City Hall, serving the whims of one man. The DSA should not be Mamdani street game. Particularly given the DSA, even though 1/5 of it is in the NYC, is a national organization. This brings us to Tara E's Zora Mamdani, There Is No Socialism Without Black Socialism, which was published in Geese magazine, which offers a strategic analysis of the New York mayor's relationship with Black voters and the city's Black political establishment. The author, who is a member of the NYDSA and a Black person, argues that while Mayor Mamdani successfully won the general election by playing ball with traditional Black Democratic political candidates and that establishment, the transactional inside of strategy is unsustainable. Tara argues to truly achieve Mandani's vision of an affordability agenda and to prevent ongoing displacement of the Black working class, Mandani must rely his reliance on an eroding corporate-backed Black establishment and instead build a durable coalition empowering independent Black socialist insurgents to operate within the city government and the Democratic Party. During the Democratic primary, Mamdani failed to win a majority of the Black precincts, which tend to vote with more conservative Democrats. This is actually a national trend, one that's been pointed out before. This is also an issue for union bases, which union leadership tends to be more conservative than the Democrats they back too. They backed Cuomo, for example. This is often said to represent the mass of workers, but A, unions don't, even in New York, and B, beyond that, union membership often has little to say over its endorsement process, depending on the charter of the union. I know I don't get a say in who my union endorses at all. While grassroots organizations like the Afro-Socialist Caucus and NYC-DSA mobilized heavily to fix this in the general election, Mandani simultaneously sought the backing of traditional establishment figures like Hakeem Jeffries and Kamala Harris to legitimize his platform. Mamdani's current strategy relies on protecting establishment figures from left-wing challenges in exchange for their legislative support. Very similar to what Sid was talking about with Brad Launder, and you're going to see more and more of it, frankly. Such as helping to pass his recent budget, which required aid from the state government. A key casualty of this strategy was City Councilman Che O.C. When O.C. sought the DSA's endorsement to challenge the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Mandani said no to protect his relationship with Jeffries, and also because, frankly, O.C. didn't really have that much of a chance of winning, but maybe he could have with Mandani's endorsement. I don't know. I was actually somewhat skeptical of O.C. and actually thought that running against Jeffries in a district where he is largely popular would take more work than O.C. had time to do. But nonetheless, it is interesting, however, that Mandani did not side with DSA activists there either. The author stresses that the Black political establishment is inherently antagonistic to the socialist project, particularly people like Hakeem Jeffries and Gregory Meeks, who are corporate-backed, take money from the real estate lobbies and from AIPAC, and view democratic socialism as a threat to their own power and a threat to the popularity of their progressive base. Remember, it's hard to put this into words now, but 20 years ago, Hakeem Jeffries was a darling of progressives because he was one of the first Muslims in Congress. Oh, how times change. Transactional alliances are fickle and bound to fracture as political conditions shift, meaning Mamdani cannot rely on them to pass truly transformative legislation anyway, since that legislation would not be in their best interest. The traditional black democratic machine is decaying and failing to recruit youth, and even true in the South, where it is stronger than in New York. And I know people would think, oh, it's very strong in New York. Yeah, but it's a lot stronger in the South. It's basically where the black political machine has its most power is in the Southern Democratic Party, and it's also where the Democrats are still, despite the removal of the Dixiecrats, some of the most conservative. The black working class in NYC faces a severe affordability crisis, in some ways even greater than the one that affects NYC in general, resulting in a loss of some 200,000 black residents in the last 20 years. Exit polls reveal that Mamdani won a supermajority of black youth aged 18 to 29, but these same black youth do not support people like Jeffries and Meeks. Nearly half of black New Yorkers are foreign born, and nearly 2/3 are renters and do not benefit from the kinds of policies Jeffries and Meeks promote. This massive emergent demographic is highly unionized because it's largely tied to the city's municipal unions. Seriously, that's why. But deeply impacted by gentrification, and thus, and sadly, currently lacks a cohesive political home since it does not feel comfortable with the black political establishment of baby boomers and Gen Xers who currently make up a lot of the black congressional caucus. So you have a similar call that you see from Sid from Tara from Geese Magazine, which is interesting because Geese is usually more aligned with groundwork. The caucus that Sid's article is actually backdoor criticizing. The author asserts that Mandani must choose between an eroding establishment or a young, active black coalition that is willing to mobilize for him. Specifically, that Mandani to enforce the DSA's 4 black insurgent candidates running against moderate in Congress, including Conrad Blackburn, Desiree Avila Chevrolet, Eon Huntley, and Christian Celeste Tate. Now, Mugg would say, why isn't he just endorsing the entire DSA slate altogether? And apparently Hassan Piker now agrees with Mugg. So even the Democratic Party bugaboos like Piker are beginning to line up here. But it's interesting that that isn't happening. The Tara warns that if Mandani refuses to cultivate a bench of black socialist successors, he will leave office like former Mayor Bill de Blasio, or like Barack Obama, except socialister. A mere manager of entrenched inequality and of dwindling political participation, which has actually been the story of New York politics going up to the Mandani Cuomo election. Shoring up black socialist power in New York City is not just local, because black workers are historically the most unionized and organized. That I'm going to put an asterisk in that. That is only true in the Northeast. Black workers, the majority of whom are still in the Southeast, are not the most unionized and organized. They are the least. The reason why black workers in the Northeast are more unionized is because municipal unions play a huge part of the base, and because of civil rights laws being more readily and actively enforced in state and local government, even in states not under the purview of the Civil Rights Act, which is not relevant here, but is relevant for like schooling and whatnot. Those city workers are highly unionized. But again, black workers are the most unionized and organized in the Northeast, but not in the United States as a whole. And that's an interesting assumption that one thinks one can extrapolate from this. One can say, though, that black workers are the most likely to work in municipal government, blue-collar jobs, as opposed to white-collar jobs, which have a still higher level of unionization than many other jobs. But I would be hard-pressed to say that they're the most unionized and organized in the country. I think that's a misstatement. And it's hard to actually double check, but it would be hard for me to believe, because I know that most black workers in the Southeast, where a lot of black people, i.e. most of them, live, are not unionized in any significant manner at all, even in the government sector. So Mandani has claims that he believes in democratic socialism even more than he did before the election. So that's an interesting thing to think about when looking at this, but it doesn't answer the question because he's making more and more deals with regular ends of the Democratic Party and with the real estate industry. Last article is The Populist and the Workers' Party, which was published by Armozy and Amanda Levy and published in Prometheus magazine in March of 2026, which critiques a modern trend of left populism, which of course I also hate, and the organizational model of parties like Jean Mélenchon's LFI, or what we call in English Front Unbowed, in Spain's Podemos. And this is often loosely tied to people like Mandani, believe it or not. The authors argue that populist approach, which rejects party structures in favor of loose, flexible movements, is a democratic blind alley. They propose a return to and a reclaiming of the structured workers' party modeled after Karl Marx's radical democratic conception of worker state. Now, obviously, I have a lot to say about this because I and Daniel Tutt wrote a whole book on this matter. It's a short book. It's about 80 pages, and it's available on June 25th. Go watch this space to find out more. So I'm, of course, sympathetic to this. I've also had representatives of France Unbowed on the show. So I think that people know that I'm not totally hostile. And there are parts of France Unbowed that I actively think are pretty useful. But France Unbowed explicitly avoids styling itself as a traditional party, referring to itself as a movement. It lacks standard party features. There's no formal registration of dues membership, no representative party congress, no elected center committee. There are low barrier action groups and a centralized email list. And there is the figure of Mélenchon and a few academies that attached to that. So I actually disagree that it's just action groups and email lists. And I'm sure Henry would talk about this, but this is kind of a problem. Why LFI claims to favor horizontality and efficiently over rigid bureaucracy, the authors argue that this is Assad. Stripping away any form of democratic procedure simply concentrates decision-making power in the hand of a small, unaccountable group of loyalists surrounding a charismatic leader, Mélenchon. I have implied that Mélenchon is a soft form of left Bonapartism myself, and so I am sympathetic to this argument. Zoomocracy and informal power seem to dominate the talking points here. Left populist models often substitute robust face-to-face democratic debate with popularism, online polls, and rubber stamping referendums. Because there's no transparent channels to elect leadership or proposed policy amendments, the brass controls everything through informal co-optation. It's a way to create a cargo cult, according to this. And this creates an electoral machine that functions intensely during presidential campaigns, but alienates activists outside of election seasons. And I hate to say this, but I think we see this in Mamdani too, which is why I included this in our 3 articles. Because it's based off of the Sanders model of abject movementism that isn't anti-party because the group exists within a party. The DSA mostly still operates within the Democratic Party itself, but doesn't have real mechanisms of accountability outside of it. The DSA, when it comes to Sanders, may have been one of the tip of the spear, so to speak, but the shaft was very much progressives, various packs that formed out of our revolution. I've covered them in my long episode on packs that I did a couple weeks ago that you should probably listen to if you want to know how the progressive space actually works, since most of the people talking out of their ass about this don't, whether it's for or against it. Now, the authors trace this organizational style back to the left populist theorists like Chantal Mouffe. I also don't like American populism either, which I seem to have still liquidated into the Democratic Party and still being given Bonapartist tendencies. I've been given criticism for focusing too much on European populism and not enough on American populism, but I don't think there's a substantive difference because the class contradictions and collaborationisms that undergird both of them require a strong executive that frankly has to become more and more authoritarian to hold power as the interests of his various bases are in conflict. This is true whether right or left. These people like Moof and even my friend Henry talk about replacing traditional working class politics with the people versus the oligarchy dichotomy, which is no different than the Sanders 99% versus 1%, just with left math. And one that all kinds of Democrats can jump on too because it's easy to control. This ideology prioritizes immediate, fast-paced electoral victories over patience in the work of durable, long-term working class institutions. The authors dismiss proponents who argue that mass workers' parties are obsolete, an argument that they label an appeal to novelty, which is probably true, noting that top-down parliamentary organizations rely purely on media branding, which are actually a regression to weaker early 19th century political forms and led to Bernoullism in the first place. The article challenges the previous Leninist definition of Workers' Party, though, which often categorizes the group strictly on their sociological makeup. Mary Marx views in the Paris Commune, the two authors, say a worker state was not defined by sweeping economic decrees, but by the fact the workmen actually governed the state, because the Paris Commune was the model of the dictatorship of the proletariat without the dictatorship part. The authors argue a true workers' party must be constitutionally and structurally governed by the working class, not by key figures speaking for it. That anything less would just be left Bonapartism and have all the problems attendant thereof, which, as you guess, as a writer of a book on this topic, I would be sympathetic to. All right. They call for a new prefigurative blueprint of party republics to replace top-down and bottom-up left populism with a vertically and horizontally laid out principles for a democratic workers' party that also prefigures the workers' state that it would do. One, it would be based on member sovereignty, where the party must function like a democratic republic, where general members act as sovereigns, citizens of that republic, not sovereign citizens as in the weird American political movement. A representative Congress must hold the highest power to elect leadership and vote on major issues within the party. They also encourage, and this is something Mugg would agree with, an active right to form internal tendencies and faction that should not just exist on paper, but actively be cultivated as a vibrant public culture of debate and theoretical development within the party itself. Kind of like the different orders of the Catholic Church, but with less allegiance to the popes. And they argue that mass membership should also be educated so that everyone could be capable of being this kind of leader to the best of their ability. The authors conclude that leftist electoral war machines might promise quick shortcuts to executive power in particular, but sometimes legislative power too, as they are less distinct in parliamentary systems in Europe. They often fail to develop the necessary political maturity for the working class to sustain themselves, and thus cannot really achieve all their goals with a broad base and have to make capitulations that they shouldn't have to make. For a socialist transformation to occur, workers must first learn how to collectively deliberate and rule within their own independent, radically democratic institutions, the primary of which would be the Workers' Party, at least according to this article. I tend to more or less agree. So when you look at this Mandani moment, of which these three articles all speak to different degrees, they refer to a crisis of getting beyond just simple wins of candidates in office and getting beyond just an affordability agenda that is superficial. And particularly since that affordability agenda is running right up into a harder economy and possible austerity measures of which Mandani cannot control. This has killed many a socialist executive in the past, particularly ones that are mayors and governors. As the three articles reveal, governing a capitalist city is a completely different base than running an insurgent campaign. This is also part of my argument about the structural differences about how the DSA helped candidates get into office, but can't really do much once they're there, which is why the DSA loses its importance. And you see this in the shift from the DSA to our revolution and the Bernie Sanders moment. You see this in Mandani setting out its own pact and the New York DSA increasingly acting independently of both the national DSA and its own base. So if we look at each of these articles that looks at the current Mandani administration and other groups that rhyme with it abroad, we can see several structural failures in how this executive power is being wielded and potential problem points that come from within. Marxist Unity and Sid in particular point out that there's a democratic deficit and an accountability crisis in what Mamdani does. The author argues that some of these compromises might be necessary, particularly like endorsing Governor Hochul, are happening in a cone of silence where one can't tell if there's legitimate support for them or not. Because the NYDSA leadership blindly defends him rather than being transparent about these trade-offs, the organization holding its own independent socialist identity gets swallowed up by both the Democratic Party and the New York government, which is its own problem. Geese Magazine, which I think is completely unaffiliated, but I do associate it, and I know some of its editorial members are part of Groundwork Caucus, diagnoses a coalition building and baseline voter block error, but one that has a similar accountability crisis as the one spoken about by the Marxist Unity Group and Light and Air. The author, Tara, points out that Mandani won the general election by cutting transactional deals with moderates to peel them off of backing Cuomo, who had the backing of like many of the labor unions, etc. But by protecting these central figures from left-wing and primary challengers and insurgents, Mamdani is alienating the younger radical black working class that actually holds the key to his long-term survival and was crucial to his win in the city, even if Mamdani did not win black voters overall, which is fair enough. Prometheus diagnoses a micro-organizational and structural flaw that has occurred in all these movements that are often focused on horizontal organization, but then a strong executive figure or a strong central figure, because Mélenchon's not in the executive yet. It critique maps onto the Mandani moment because Mandani has a similar model, trying to get outside of any kind of party framework, of which the DSA legally isn't, so you can't really hold him to that, and build his movement around his own charismatic celebrity, which makes progressives on the internet happy, and you can see many Instagrams and TikToks celebrating Mamdani's balancing of the budget, etc., as if it was all easy. Really kind of wasn't, and it won't be able to do it again this same way. But nonetheless, that's what progressives want to believe. Just a matter of getting the right people in and all the systemic problems will go away, right? That's what the most political determinist people would believe. I think this is foolish, but nonetheless. So how do we fix this problem? Well, one thing they all kind of agree with is being more limited in their secrecy, being careful about backing prior incumbents and political machines that may not have Mandani's long-term interests or his base's long-term interests at heart, and by not allowing a democratic appeals outside of institutions to be the only way one gets in power, because even if it gets people in power, it doesn't necessarily lead to those people in power being accountable to anyone. Go ask MAGA how that's working for them and how much gaslighting of themselves they have to do to deal with it. All these articles, though, kind of can have a shared anxiety, which can be seen in the Ghost of the Bill de Blasio administration, who was a supporter of Mamdani. The underlying threat that all these articles together point out is the profound anxiety over co-optation, recuperation, and demoralization when things get harder from the initial win, all of which is pretty much guaranteed. None of the authors believe that Mandani is a traitor. I don't either, by the way. Rather, they recognize the structural rate of the capitalist state naturally crushing isolated progressives in an executive role when they don't have downstream and upstream support. And the upstream support Mamdani can get is from non-democratic socialists. Geese Magazine explicitly warns of the Bill de Blasio trap, which is becoming a well-meaning manager of inequity who leaves office with a demoralized base and dwindling political participation. Marxist Unity echoes this, but takes it further, warning that the entire fate of the socialist movement to a personal popularity of a single celebrity politician is highly volatile and dangerous. And Prometheus points out that this strategy actually leads to authoritarian figures under the guise of disauthoritarian politics or anti-authoritarian politics. What they would all pretty much agree on is the following. You cannot fight the capitalist threat through a charismatic executive sitting in City Hall alone. You cannot protect that executive by playing nice with corporate Democrats, which both Mugg and Geese point out. And you cannot build a mass movement by keeping regular members in the dark about the messy realities of politics and power and disallowing criticism so that power could correct itself if it was a good faith actor. Remember that tit for tat negotiations tends to be the most viable way for both parties to win their concessions, which is when the person favors you, you support them, and when they don't favor you, you don't. Now, that's a little bit harder when you're only dealing with things first past the post every 4 years, but you can do that honestly, particularly when there's no electoral stakes at hand. For the Mandani moment to transition to a permanent socialist shift, even just in New York, much less the rest of the country, the movement must build a highly democratic, organized, independent working class institution and institutions that can back up such an executive, particularly like the Mandani in New York, and hold his feet to the fire if he doesn't follow his own promises. That's easier said than done, though, as most political movements have failed to do it historically. And on that note, you can find more behind the Patreon wall. Protect your peace. Go read these articles. All three of them are linked in the show note. Don't just trust my summary of anything. And follow all these magazines. I've gotten a lot out of reading them lately. So that's Light and Air by the Marxist Unity Group. You can also see their non-Marxist Unity Group publication, but it is related to it, Cosmonaut Magazine. That is Prometheus, which is a little bit like Cosmonaut, and that is Marxist Unity. And for the Mandani moment, you can just read Jacobin, and that's probably going to be enough PR for you on that point. If you want more analysis like this, you can find more about my Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/farmvlog, and you can get access for as little as $4. There's also links and various things here. And if you don't have the money, that's fine. Leave a review. You can review the podcast. You can leave a comment here on YouTube. All that helps us grow. And if you hate me, you can leave a comment too, because that'll help me grow, unless you're really a jerk, and I'll just remove it. All right. And on that note, goodbye. And protect.